Many people have become agnostics because of the supposed conflict between the Bible and science. In truth, there is no conflict at all between a correct translation of the Bible and really proven science, not just unproved theories. One of these supposed conflicts is between the fact that science knows that human beings have lived on the earth far longer than the few thousand years covered by the Bible, and the common belief that the Bible says that Adam was the first man. But the truth is that the Bible nowhere says that Adam was the first man. Yes, I know that most of the preachers say that, but the Bible does not say it. It merely says that Adam was the first man of a new white race. The many mistranslations in the King James Version obscure much of the truth. For example, Genesis 1, verses 1 and 2. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void, as though God made it all a complete mess. In the Hebrew, however, it says, now the earth had become chaotic and empty. For example, see Rotherham's emphasized Bible. That is, some early catastrophe had wrecked the earth, which was not without form and void before that. This was a judgment of God on earlier civilizations for their wickedness. Jeremiah 4, verses 23 to 27 gives us a vision of it. I beheld the earth, and lo, it was without form and void, and the heavens, and they had no light. I beheld the mountains, and lo, they trembled, and all the hills moved lightly. I beheld, and lo, there was no man, and all the birds of the heavens were fled. I beheld, and lo, the fruitful place was a wilderness, and all the cities thereof were broken down at the presence of the Lord and by his fierce anger. For thus hath the Lord said, the whole land shall be desolate, yet will I not make a full end. Therefore we do find buried ruins of cities older than Adam, and skeletons which can be dated by the carbon-14 process as many thousands of years older. But the Bible tells us about this. Next, the Bible tells the creation of men in the plural in Genesis 1, verses 26 to 28, saying, male and female created he them. And God told these people, be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth. Plenish is an obsolete English word meaning to fill, and you cannot replenish what was never plenished or filled before. But in the next chapter, Genesis 2, we find the Adam in the singular created. The Hebrew word Adam, rendered Adam in the English, is from a root word meaning to be of a ruddy complexion, showing blood in the face. A word obviously not applicable to the dark races, which we also know from scientific evidence to be much older than the white race. And when the Bible is speaking of the particular man, Adam, who was created in Genesis chapter 2, it always says the Adam. Bible scholars know that Genesis 3, verse 20, and Adam called his wife's name Eve because she was the mother of all living, is a forgery, a later interpolation which was not in the earlier manuscripts. For example, see Moffat's translation. In Genesis 3, verse 3, when Eve tells Satan that God has said that they must not touch the fruit of the tree of good and evil, the word there translated touch is the Hebrew word naga, meaning to lie with, to have sexual intercourse with, which plainly shows that these were people and that there were other people in the world at that time. The 4th chapter of Genesis records the birth of Cain and Abel. In the Hebrew, the wording suggests that they were twins. No other child of Eve is mentioned until the birth of Seth, when Adam was 130 years old, certainly long after the birth of Cain and Abel, which most scholars say was over a century earlier. Yet, when Cain killed Abel, and in punishment was driven out of the land, he complained to God that anyone that findeth me shall slay me. That's Genesis 4, verse 14. Also, Genesis 4, verse 17 records that upon being sent away, Cain found in the land to which he went many other people, because he not only married a wife, but found enough people there to build a city. These were the pre-Adamite races mentioned in the latter part of Genesis chapter 1. The Garden of Eden was not a plantation of ordinary trees and shrubs. God did nothing so foolish as to make a special creation just to have a man to wield shovel and pruning shears, when he already had millions of pre-Adamite peoples available for that sort of work. We are told that the Garden of Eden contained the tree of the knowledge or experience of good and evil. Now, no tree of the forest has any knowledge or experience of either good or evil. And the 31st chapter of Ezekiel says, "Behold, the Assyrian was a cedar in Lebanon, with fair branches and a shadowing bough, and of a high stature. Therefore his height was exalted above all the trees of the field, and his boughs were multiplied, and his branches became long. All the fowls of heaven made their nests in his boughs, and under his branches did all the beasts of the field bring forth their young, and under his shadow dwelt all great nations." The cedars in the garden of God could not hide him. The fir trees were not like his boughs, and the chestnut trees were not like his branches, nor any tree in the garden of God was like unto him in his beauty. I have made him fair by the multitude of his branches, so that all the trees of Eden that were in the garden of God envied him. Obviously, the trees in the Garden of God in Eden were family trees of races and nations who admired and envied the early Assyrian Empire, for an ordinary wooden tree can't envy anybody. These races and nations made up the garden that Adam was to cultivate. That is, Satan had been what we might call the superintendent or governor of this planet, to rule it in obedience to God's will, until he forfeited that position by rebellion against God. Adam was sent to take his place. It was Adam's job to rule the various nations and races of the earth as God's representative here, educating them in God's laws and enforcing obedience to those laws. These other races and nations had been here many thousands of years before Adam. Therefore, the Bible makes it unmistakably clear that we are not all descended from Adam and Eve, for there were other races on earth, already old, already numerous, when Adam was created. And among these other races, there are several who are simply pre-Adamic, and one at least which is satanic. If you will read the 3rd chapter of Genesis, you will notice that immediately after the fall of Adam, when God required them to answer what they had done, God condemned Satan. The word mistranslated serpent here is the Hebrew word nokash, which literally means enchanter or magician. And no doubt Satan, still possessing many of his angelic powers, was able to be an enchanter or magician. It is certain that the one who seduced Eve was no mere scaly snake wriggling along the ground. Yes, I said seduced Eve, for that is what she admitted in the original Hebrew, and Cain was the son of that seduction. The Bible uses the word begat with monotonous regularity in tracing family trees, but the first time the Bible ever says that Adam begat anyone is Genesis 5, verse 3, where it says, "And Adam lived 130 years and begat a son in his own likeness after his image, and called his name Seth." But to get back to Genesis 3, verse 15, God said to Satan, "I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed." The same Hebrew word for seed is used in both cases. Satan was to have just as literal seed or descendants as Eve. God's own word being pledged to this, we must expect to find it actually happening. And we do. Jesus Christ himself tells us of it. In Matthew 13, verses 38 and 39, in explaining the parable of the tares among the wheat, Jesus says, "The field is the world. The good seed are the children of the kingdom, but the tares are the children of the wicked one. The enemy that sowed them is the devil." Again in John 6, verses 70 and 71, Jesus had been talking with his 12 disciples, and we read, "Jesus answered them, Have not I chosen you 12? And one of you is a devil." He spake of Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon, for he it was that should betray him, being one of the 12. And again you should read very carefully the 8th chapter of the Gospel of John, where Jesus told those who hated him, "Ye are of your father the devil, and the lusts of your father ye will do." He was not being vulgarly abusive in either of these cases, for he never resorted to name-calling for abuse. He did call some of them hypocrites, which they truly were, so his statement was precisely accurate. He did call some of them serpents, children of vipers, which again was accurate. Long before this, the children of Satan had adopted the serpent as a symbol or emblem of Satan, and that is why their tradition eventually gave the word Nakash the secondary meaning of serpent, when its original true meaning is enchanter. Jesus therefore was telling them that they were of their father the devil, or serpent if they preferred that word. In this he was simply stating a biological fact with scientific precision and identifying the persons of this ancestry. Whenever someone tells you that the Bible is in conflict with what modern science has proved true, don't you believe it. The things that many preachers teach are in conflict with scientific truth, as we all know. But these preachers are equally in conflict with the Bible. Go back to the Bible, not to any man-made doctrines, and double-check it for accuracy of translation. You will find that what the Bible really says in its original languages is accurate with a precision that our scientists have not yet achieved. This is Bertrand Dale Comparet, and I have a few things in my mind about which I'd like to talk to you. The first of these is the fact that contrary to what is taught in most churches, Noah's flood was not worldwide. Among the many mistaken and unscriptural notions commonly taught in nearly all churches is the idea that the flood mentioned in the Bible covered all the earth and drowned everybody on earth excepting only Noah and his family, who escaped death by being in the ark. So many churches have firmly insisted that the Bible says this, when there is ample proof that the flood was not worldwide, that they have destroyed the faith of multitudes of people in the Bible, made atheists or agnostics out of hundreds of thousands of people who might have become Christians if they had only been taught the truth about the Bible. Part of this mistaken idea about the flood is due to the many mistranslations found in the commonly used King James Version of the Bible. But also, part of it appears plainly to be false if you merely carefully read even the King James Version. Let's have a look at this. In Genesis chapter 6, we read that God found the people so corrupt that he regretted that he had ever created them, and so he decided to wipe them out by a flood. And he warned righteous Noah of the coming flood, and told Noah to build a great boat or ark in which he and his family might find safety, and where they might preserve a few of each kind of the animals. In chapter 7, it tells how Noah received the final warning that the time was now at hand, and that he should move into the ark. Then it says, according to the King James Version, "And it came to pass after 7 days that the waters of the flood were upon the earth. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, the 17th day of the month, the same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. And the rain was upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights. And the waters prevailed, and were increased greatly upon the earth, and the ark went upon the waters. And the waters prevailed exceedingly upon the earth, and all the high hills that were under the whole heaven were covered. 15 cubits upward did the waters prevail, and the mountains were covered. And all flesh died that moved upon the earth, both of fowl and of cattle and of beast, and of every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth, and every man. And the waters prevailed upon the earth 150 days. And God remembered Noah and every living thing, and all the cattle that was with him in the ark. And God made a wind to pass over the earth, and the waters assuaged. And the waters returned from off the earth continually. And after the end of the 150 days, the waters were abated. And the ark rested in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, upon the mountains of Ararat. And the waters decreased continually until the 10th month. In the 10th month, on the 1st day of the month, were the tops of the mountains seen." Now, first let's see what the translators have done to what Moses originally wrote. You remember that the King James Version says that the rain was upon the earth, and the waters increased greatly upon the earth. and that all flesh died that moved upon the earth. But are they right in translating this, the earth? Definitely not. Remember that in Genesis 4:14, when God has driven Cain away in punishment for his murder of Abel, the King James Version quotes Cain as saying, "Behold, thou hast driven me out this day from the face of the earth." So what did Cain do? Climb into his rocket ship and take off for outer space? Of course not. He was not driven from the face of the earth, and he never said so. Only the translators said so. The word Cain used was Adamah, meaning the ground. God had told him that his farming would no longer be successful. So Cain says, "Thou hast driven me off of the ground." And you have probably noticed that Cain's descendants today are not farmers. They run pawn shops and other money-lending institutions. When we come to the 7th chapter of Genesis, where it is talking about the flood, wherever it says that the flood covered the earth, the Hebrew word used in the original writing by Moses was eretz, meaning the land. The flood did cover that particular land where it occurred. That is, it was a local flood which covered one particular region or land, but not the whole earth. Again, notice that it specifies that 15 cubits upward did the waters prevail, and the mountains were covered. In ancient times, 2 different lengths of the cubit were in use. The Hebrew sacred cubit of 25 inches and the common cubit of 20 5/8 inches. Therefore, the waters rose above the tops of the mountains of which it is speaking by either 25 feet 9 inches or 31 feet 3 inches, according to which cubit you use. If this meant that all the mountains on earth were covered, the waters would have to cover Mount Everest, which is nearly 6 miles high. Therefore, all the earth would be covered by water 6 miles deep. In that case, where could it have run off to when the flood subsided? No, I don't mean that the Bible was that badly mistaken. Only the translators made this mistake, because they took a Hebrew word, eretz, which means that land, and mistranslated it to mean the whole world. A little later, we shall look over the evidence which proves where that land was. But if the whole earth was covered by 6 miles of water, then all the nations must have been completely exterminated. Yet Babylonian, Egyptian, and Chinese history runs right through this period without a break. The Bible gives the date of Noah's flood as commencing in 2345 BC and ending in 2344 BC. In Lower Sumer, later called Chaldea, and which occupied the same plains of Shinar to which Noah's family journeyed after the flood, the city of Ur of the Chaldees was the leading city from about 2400 BC until about 2285 BC, and its history is not broken by any flood in this period. Farther to the north, Babylon was rising to power from about 2400 BC on, and reached a great height of civilization under the famous King Hammurabi, who lived at the same time as the Hebrew patriarch Abraham, about 2250 BC. And again, there is no break in this history due to a flood. In Egypt, the 11th dynasty began to reign about 2375 BC over a great and powerful nation. The 11th dynasty ruled Egypt to about 2212 BC, and were followed by the 12th dynasty, which ruled to about 2000 BC. There was no break in the 11th dynasty at the time of Noah's flood, 2345 BC, and the nation continued to be large and powerful throughout this period. Reasonably accurate history of China begins nearly 3000 BC. The Shu King, the historic record of China, shows that King Yao came to the throne in 2356 BC, 11 years before the start of Noah's flood, and that he ruled China for many years after the flood. During the reign of King Yao, the Shu King reports that the Huanghe River, which drains mountains and a great basin in Xinjiang province, had excessive floods for 3 generations. Here again, there was no break in history. The Chinese nation was not wiped out, but its own records show that it continued in existence right through the period of Noah's flood. Therefore, the Bible is correct in stating that the flood covered only Eretz, that land, and that the translators are wrong when they change the meaning of what Moses really wrote in the 7th chapter of Genesis and say that the flood covered all the earth. This leaves us ready to inquire where the flood did occur. For this, we will have to start with Adam and Eve and trace where they and their descendants went. They started out in the Garden of Eden. Genesis 2, verses 10 to 14 tells us that a river went out of Eden, and this river divided into 4 streams. It names these 4 rivers, Pison and Gihon, neither of which can be identified among the rivers existing today, and Hiddekel, which is the ancient name of the Tigris River, and Phrath, the ancient name of the river Euphrates. The Tigris and Euphrates rise in what is today extreme southeastern Turkey, a little north of modern Iraq. Making some allowance for the fact that many rivers have changed their courses considerably in the course of several thousand years, this still places the Garden of Eden at the northern end of ancient Akkad. When Adam and Eve were driven out of the Garden of Eden, Genesis 3, verse 24 tells us that God placed cherubim with a flaming sword at the east side of the Garden of Eden to keep Adam and Eve from returning and having access to the tree of life. If this guard was to accomplish anything, it must have been placed between Adam and the Garden of Eden. So we see that Adam and Eve were driven out to the eastward. From Eden, Adam's course would naturally have led him across northern Iran, around the southern end of the Caspian Sea, into what was formerly called Chinese Turkestan, and today is known as Xinjiang Province, in the extreme west of China. In the southern part of Xinjiang, there is a great basin rimmed by high mountains on all sides, but with an outlet on the eastern end of it, through the mountains where the headwaters of the Huanghe, the Yellow River, rises. This basin is today nearly all desert, but it bears the evidence of a fertile and heavily inhabited past. Explorers have found ruins of ancient cities uncovered by the drifting sands of the desert. Also, the known geological structure shows that in ancient times, at least, beneath this desert lay an enormous underground natural reservoir, great caverns filled with water, the same geological structure which furnishes artesian water in many parts of the world today. These underground reservoirs were covered by waterproof layers of rock, which kept the waters beneath from overflowing out on the land surface above them. In this mountain-rimmed basin, which was then a fertile, well-populated land, Adam and Eve, or at least their descendants of a few generations later, settled. You who listen to our program already know that Adam was not the first man. He was only the first man in the present white race. Adam and Eve found this land to which they had come already populated by an Asiatic people, among whom they had to live. Through the following generations, the inevitable happened. Wherever there is integration, then intermarriage and mongrelization of the races follows. But if God had no purposes in mind which could not be properly served by the Asiatic and Negro races, there would have been no reason for him to create Adam. Neither could the purposes which Adam and his descendants were intended to serve be fulfilled by a mongrelized race. The consequences of this mongrelization are described in Genesis 6, verse 5. And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Again, we find that the word there mistranslated earth is the Hebrew word eretz, which means only the land, that particular land. And there is reason for using that Hebrew word, for this was the place where integration and mongrelization had taken place, with its degenerative effects as compared to the qualities possessed by each race separately. We find confirmation of this in the reason why God spared Noah. In Genesis 6, verse 9, your King James Version of the Bible tells you that Noah was perfect in his generations, a meaningless phrase. When anything in the King James Version of the Bible fails to make good sense, it is a sign that you should go behind the mistranslation and see what the words were in the original Hebrew or Greek. The word here translated generations was the Hebrew word toledo, which means ancestry. That is, Noah was perfect in his ancestry, a thoroughbred, not a mongrel. Noah and his family were the last remaining pure-blooded Adamites in the world. Therefore, God needed to save them to carry out the purposes he had planned for the Adamic people. The mongrelized people among whom Noah and his family lived must be removed, else they would be a trap which would eventually lead to the complete end of the pure-blooded Adamites. Have we any other evidence to support our view that this was the region where Adam and Eve and their descendants settled? Yes. Remember that Adam and Eve were driven out of Eden to the eastward. Later, when Cain murdered Abel, and as a punishment was banished from the land where Adam and Eve lived, Genesis 4 verse 16 tells us that Cain went out from the presence of the Lord and dwelt in the land of Nod on the east of Eden. The Hebrew word Nod means wandering. That is, in the upper Tigris and Euphrates valleys at the north of Eden, these rivers were running swiftly downhill from their mountain sources. Therefore, they cut themselves deep channels in the ground, and even today we can find the traces of the ancient diversion dams built by the ancients to raise the water level up close to the surface of the ground so they would not have to pump it so high to get it into their irrigation canals. But further to the south, in the lower Tigris and Euphrates valleys, where the slope was no longer steep, the accumulation of silt picked up of the rivers where they ran swiftly was now settling to the bottom of the riverbeds, constantly raising the level, so that every high water season the rivers overflowed their banks and flooded the valleys, exactly the same as we have had in our own Mississippi Valley. These annual floods washed away the people's houses and sent them fleeing far away to high ground. Therefore, it was correctly called the land of Nod, the land of wandering. Here Cain settled and taught the people to build high dikes along the river banks, just as we have done along the banks of the Mississippi River. This enabled them to stop the annual floods, so they could now build permanent cities of good houses in the lower Tigris and Euphrates valleys, the land then called by its own inhabitants Sumer, and later called Chaldea. In a very few places, the Bible calls it the plain of Shinar. That is, Cain went back westward from where Adam and Eve lived. It was thus that Cain started his great empire. Yes, Cain is a well-known historical character, not found only in the Bible, but he is known in history under another name. He established an empire which extended from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea, and even took in some of the larger islands in the Mediterranean Sea. Someday I'll tell you about Cain and his empire, but that's another story. Another bit of evidence is found in Genesis 11, verse 2, which tells us that after the flood, Noah's descendants journeyed from the east until they came to the land of Shinar. Therefore, they must have come from some place east of the Tigris and Euphrates valleys. And the only place where such a flood as the Bible describes could have occurred, eastward from the Tigris and Euphrates valleys, is this mountain basin in Sinkiang, which I have been talking about. Another bit of evidence is found in the high water mark found in many places along the mountains which rim this basin, showing that at one time this basin was a lake extending to this well-marked shoreline. The mountains which rim this valley were not fully covered, for many of them range from 16,000 to 25,000 feet in height, and one even rises more than 28,000 feet. But within the basin are several smaller mountains which could be fully covered by a flood held within the higher rim of the valley. In short, this basin, through which flows the Tarim River, and which is sometimes known as the Tarim Basin in southern Sinkiang, is identified as the site of Noah's flood. In your King James Version, Genesis 7, verses 11 and 12 read, In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, the 17th day of the month, the same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up, and the windows of heaven were open. And the rain was upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights. More careful translation makes clear what really happened. In Moffat's Modern English Translation we read, "The fountains of the great abyss all burst, and the sluices of heaven were opened." In Smith and Goodspeed's American Translation it says, "The fountains of the great abyss were all broken open, and the windows of the heavens were opened." That is, a great earthquake broke up the waterproof layer of rock over the immense water-filled abyss or cavern beneath this Tarim Basin, causing the floor of the valley to settle, and allowed an enormous underground reservoir to overflow and to submerge the valley floor. The great earthquake in the Himalaya Mountains about 10 years ago produced similar effects in some places. Of course, the 40 days of torrential rains added to the flood. This filled the valley high enough to submerge the low mountains which were inside the valley. This is exactly as Genesis 7, verses 19 to 20 says. Don't be misled by the mistranslation, "All the high hills that were under the whole heaven were covered." The word mistranslated heaven is merely the Hebrew word shameh, meaning the sky. Since this Tarim Basin is somewhat more than 350 miles wide by more than 650 miles long, all the sky visible from anywhere near the center of this valley would cover only this valley, and therefore only those lower mountains which were within the valley itself. But what about Genesis 8, verse 4, reading, "And the ark rested in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, upon the mountains of Ararat." Sometimes failure to translate can be just as misleading as outright mistranslation. Most people understand this to mean Mount Ararat in Armenia, some 1,600 miles west of the Tarim Basin. But this is not what the Bible says. First of all, note that it says mountains of Ararat, mountains being in the plural, while Mount Ararat in Armenia is only a single peak. But Mount Ararat in Armenia was known until comparatively recent times as Mount Massis, and nobody had ever heard of it being called Mount Ararat in Bible times. Furthermore, the Hebrew word Ararat means only the tops of the hills. Therefore, correctly translated, Genesis 8 verse 4 merely says that the ark came to rest upon the tops of the high hills, some of the lower mountains which were within the Tarim Valley. A recent newspaper report mentions an expedition equipped with the latest electronic equipment which is going to Mount Ararat in Armenia to find the ark, and which will melt the ice which covers the ark by coating it with black powdered carbon. But they won't find Noah's ark, for it is not there. Several expeditions have gone to this Mount Ararat to find the ark, and some of them got within sight of a mast on the side of a mountain, which, from that particular point of view, looked to be shaped somewhat like a ship. That point has been very carefully inspected from the air by airplanes flying over it very close, and it has proved to be nothing but a ledge of rock, which does give a silhouette shaped like a ship when seen from the right direction. I needn't mention the many places, such as the Grand Canyon and so forth, where similar ship rocks can be seen, and none of them are Noah's Ark. So when we carefully examine the whole affair and correct the mistranslations, we find there is no conflict between what the Bible really says and either science or history. In fact, there never is any such conflict. It is only the preachers who find themselves contradicted by either science or history. And that is only because they either won't take the trouble to find out what the Bible really says, or because they have made the mistranslation a supposedly sacred church doctrine, and now they are stuck with it. Don't let any church shake your faith in the Bible. The Bible is always right, even if the churches are often wrong. Let us remember another thing. The ancient Chinese historical record, the Shu King, records that during the reign of King Yao, at a time beginning about the date of Noah's flood, the Huang Ho carried excessive floods for 3 generations. Drainage out of the Tarim Basin to the eastward would have been carried off in the Huang Ho River and would account for this. Now we come to another false doctrine taught in many churches, that since nobody survived in all the earth except Noah and his family, everybody now living is a descendant of Noah and related by blood, no matter what race they belong to. But we have already seen that the flood did not cover the whole earth, but only one valley, about 350 by 650 miles in size. The Chinese history was not interrupted by it, although they do record purely local floods in the Huang Ho Valley, where the waters were draining off. We have seen that Egyptian history is not interrupted by the flood, so the continent of Africa was not touched by it, and the Negro race continued unaffected by it. It would be absurd to think that Noah and his wife, both of them being white, could have one white child, one Negro child, and one Chinese child. Remember that in Genesis 1, verses 11 to 25, when God created the world and its inhabitants and made the laws governing their reproduction, He did not make it absurd chaos with whales giving birth to cattle and fish hatching out of birds' eggs. His law, repeated several times for emphasis, is always that each creature must bring forth strictly after his own kind. The churches which teach this false doctrine of everybody being descended from Noah never got it out of the Bible, that is, in any true translation of the Bible. As Moses wrote it in the Hebrew language under divine inspiration, the Bible correctly tells that Noah's descendants went out into a world already populated by people who had lived right through the time of the flood and were still going strong. Farrar Fenton's modern English translation gives this correctly. In Genesis 10, verses 1 to 5, we read of the descendants of Noah's son Japheth, and it says, "From these they spread themselves over the sea coasts of the countries of the nations, each with their own language amongst the Gentile tribes." Genesis 10, verse 20 tells of the descendants of Noah's son Ham. These were the sons of Ham in their tribes and languages in the regions of the heathen. Genesis 10, verse 31 completes it. These are the sons of Shem, by their tribes and by their languages, in their countries among the heathen. So never let anybody tell you that the Bible consists of the fables of a primitive people. It is perfectly consistent with all true science and all true history. It is the history of our race, the Anglo-Saxon, Scandinavian, and Teutonic white race. Tonight I've got something a little different in mind. Heretofore I've been talking only about Israel, because we, the Anglo-Saxon, Scandinavian, and Teutonic peoples, are the Israel of the Bible, and the Bible is Israel's book. But tonight I want to take in a still bigger field, the Adamic race. Fully 98% of everything you've ever been told in your churches is false. Most of it told with good intentions because they don't know any better. You've been told, of course, that Adam was the father of the whole human race, and then it was all wiped out except 8 persons, and Noah was the father of the whole human race, Chinaman, Negroes, everybody since then. The Bible never makes any such statement, but the preachers do. They've made a church doctrine and they're stuck with it. Adam was not the first human being, and the Bible never says he was. Now, the Bible uses 3 different words that have been indiscriminately translated man in most of your Bibles. There is the word ish, which literally means a male person, and also it means a husband, and it can be used correctly of a man of any race. Then the Bible uses the word, in the Hebrew, the word enosh, which literally means mortal, and it has a general connotation
of a most unfavorable sort, weakness morally as well as physically. That is not used of God's people Israel or even the real Adamic race. Now the third word, the Hebrew word Adam, which has been anglicized into Adam, its root meaning is of a ruddy, fair complexion, which, as you can see, leaves the dark races out. Now, we find skeletons of other races so old that they're even fossilized when it comes to the Turanian or Mongoloid race. Some of them have been estimated as around 600,000 years old. Well, that's only a guess, of course, and assume they're wrong by 200,000 years either way. It's still a long time before the Adam of the Bible. Identifiably Negroid skeletons have been found that can be dated by some of the radioactive processes as approximately 70,000 years old, which again is way before the time of the Bible's Adam. There are over 27,000 places in your commonly used King James Version of the Bible where it is mistranslated. I have my own private theory that there is some sub-basement of hell heated especially hot for the translators. But then that's my own personal theory, and I can't quote you a Bible verse on it. But these truths have been concealed until a few scholars in recent times started digging back into the original languages to see what it said. In the first chapter of Genesis, it starts out, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, which is correct. No date is given. 15 minutes ago, 15 billion years ago, anything you want to read into it, no date is given. Then your King James Version says, and the peoples, the Mongoloid and the Negro, were left here. Then, still in the first chapter of Genesis, it records the creation of the first white race on the earth. Male and female created he them, plural now, and told them to increase and multiply and replenish the earth, refill the earth. And there, although some people, to support their own theories, will tell you something different and say that it referred to them as Enosh, it didn't. You look it up for yourself in your concordance, and even in the first chapter, it calls them Adam. So he created a white race. Now, there are plenty of white people in the world who are not in any way related to Israel. The other Adamites are our distant relatives, but there are whites who are not Adamites in the sense of being descendants of the Adam who shows up in the second chapter of Genesis. Now, wherever God is speaking simply of white people in general, it calls them Adam. But when it is speaking of this one particular man, the word is changed, and he is careful to say the Adam, singular. So in the second chapter of Genesis, it tells that God created this new being, the Adam. Satan has been the governor of this planet, maybe others besides, but at least the governor of this planet, and rightfully so, under appointment by God, until he forfeited his right to it by rebellion against God. Now, God didn't go to all the trouble of creating a special person to take a spade and dig up a little bit around some plants and shrubs. He had millions of Asiatics who could do that, and millions of Negroes who could have done it if they weren't too stupid. They just needed somebody to show them how. Adam was sent here to kick Satan out and take over the government of this planet as Satan's successor. Now, we're true descendants of Adam. We're as stupid as he, and we haven't learned anything in all the intervening centuries. He had our quality. He liked peace. He didn't like to make trouble. If you can just have peaceful coexistence, you know, as long as they're talking, they aren't fighting and all this stuff. So, instead of kicking Satan out, he disobeyed. He made his peace with Satan, and by his own disobedience, he forfeited his right to power, the same as Satan did. We've been in trouble ever since. God saw that being his descendants and with his stupidity, we were going to have to learn the hard way, just as Adam did, so we've had our noses rubbed in it ever since. The trees in the Garden of Eden were not ordinary wooden trees such as grow in a park or a forest. There were some of those, too, yes, for things to eat. But you were told of a particular tree, the tree that had knowledge of both good and evil. Can you show me any such tree in any park or forest anywhere in the world? Of course not. Then there's a place, I think it's in Jeremiah, could be Ezekiel, I could look it up if it were important, where it talks about the first Assyrian Empire, not the one that you find described at length in the Bible, invading Western Asia, but thousands of years before that. And it says the Assyrian was a mighty cedar in Lebanon, and taller than all the other trees that dwelt in his shadow and so forth. And all the trees of the garden of God in Eden envied him. Got any tree growing in your backyard that envies anybody? This was a family tree of races and nations, and we still use that expression, you notice, a tree. Now, you'll find again reference to this in the 3rd chapter of Genesis. Satan comes to Eve and he says, why, is it true that God said you can't eat from any of these trees in the garden here? Eve says, oh no, we can eat from all of them, except the tree which stands in the midst of the garden. God has said, ye shall not, of the fruit thereof, ye shall not eat, neither shall ye touch it, lest ye die. Now that is mistranslated, so it doesn't give its meaning. The word translated fruit there is the Hebrew word pirtok, and it means descendants, progeny, children, grandchildren, and so on. And the word translated touch is the Hebrew word naga, which is a more polite expression meaning to have sexual intercourse with. Do you have to be warned not to have sexual intercourse with an apple or a walnut or something of that sort? No. So you see, the Bible recognizes the existence of these other races. Adam was sent here not to mix and mongrelize with them, but to rule them with a heavy hand, because that's all they understand. Then eventually you find, beginning in the 5th chapter of Genesis, the descendants of Adam, the Adam. Now, that is a part of the white race, there being, as we have seen, other light-complected peoples who go clear back to the 1st chapter of Genesis, where the Adam doesn't come into this until you get to the 2nd chapter of Genesis. Now you'll note, following on down through the book of Genesis, in each generation from Adam down, the Bible only bothers picking out one person in that generation to trace. It mentions and so had other sons and daughters, but it picks the one by name to carry it out. Now, God was using good biology there. If you are a breeder of dogs or goldfish or something of the sort, you know what you do. You pick only the best of each generation to breed the next. Sure, in a litter of puppies, there are one or two that they're all right to give to some family who want a pet for the children. But if you enter them in a dog show, you'd be laughed out of the dog show. That's not what you keep for breeding stock. You pick just the best, so that each generation improves over what you had before, and that's what God was doing. Now you can picture this in your mind's eye as a pyramid. The very peak top of this is Adam himself, and each generation down below him is expanding with more and more people. But one single thread runs down the center, which is the generation, the one man in each generation that God traces till you get down to where finally he was satisfied with the result. And that was Jacob, whose name God himself changed to Israel, meaning he shall rule as God. That's a big job, you know. That's getting back to what Adam was told to do and failed. Now, I want to talk to you a little bit about the Adamic race and their effect upon history, because that's a big thing, too. You find in the white race some variations. They're white, but they show different variations. First, you find the Nordic stock, Teutonic, Scandinavian. They are characterized by generally considerable height. They're a tall people. A very large percentage of them are fair, though not all. You find dark hair and eyes among them, too. And an oblong, a long skull, not a round skull. Scientists classify a skull if the width from side to side is not more than 75% of the length from front to rear. They classify that as a long skull type. If the width is 80% or more, that is classified as the broad skull, the round head type, and is one of the distinguishing characteristics between different races. These Nordic peoples all have Aryan language, something we're going to get to tonight, which will prove to be most interesting. Then you find the Mediterranean type, whose original home was in the nations bordering the Mediterranean Sea, and it is still their principal home, though they have spread considerably. You find a fairly substantial Mediterranean-type population in Ireland, for example, quite a few in Britain, quite a few in France. Today, parts of France, parts of England and Ireland, parts of Italy, Spain, Portugal. Often in these countries, they are ruled by a Nordic upper crust aristocracy. In general, the Mediterranean peoples have been, to a high degree, artistic. You will find music, for example, as a characteristic, not just that they have produced a few musical composers, but that the people in general have a keen appreciation of music. Then there is intermediate in type and in location, the Alpine group. These in general, the Mediterranean I should mention, they have the long skull. They are generally of darker complexion than the Nordic, and generally of smaller average build. Now the Alpine are a stocky, thick build as a rule. They have a round skull. They have usually a fair complexion. There are even some of them with blue eyes and blonde hair. You find a considerable number of them among the Russians and among people in some of the Balkan countries. You'll find quite a number of them in Poland, for example. And they are mixed with the Nordics in northern Italy. Most of central France and some of northern Spain has a fair-sized Alpine population. Now, you know, of course, what we have learned of history of the people of Israel. We've studied that so much. But now let's go outside that and take in the Adamic peoples, because they also had a big impact on history. Not quite as much so as the Israelite. But remember, you had the same basic stock until they perished from mongrelization. You had the same basic stock and the same qualities, though not to quite as high a degree as Israel. The first place we pick this up in verifiable history is in northern, and more particularly northwestern India. They left a considerable literature, a great number of epic poems, the Vedas. You know, of course, what Homer's Iliad and Odyssey were, the great epic poems about the Trojan War, and which give us our only record of what life was like among the early Greeks back around 1300 BC. Now, the Vedas, more particularly of them the Rig Veda, cover a period from approximately 2000 BC to approximately 1400 BC. It's a record of the customs, the religion, and the history of the Aryan conquerors of northern India. They call themselves Aryan. The word Arya means noble in Sanskrit. And they did form the nobility, the ruling aristocratic stock, when they conquered northern Italy. Their own writings say they were of fair complexion, with narrow, straight, well-bridged noses. And they ridicule the dark peoples they found in India, calling them colored and mentioning they had hardly any nose at all. It was so flat. It records their history, their original point of origin, that they came from a place which is not named, but it was high country, rimmed by tall snow-clad mountains and with rivers, rushing torrents of this melted snow water. They reveal no knowledge of tropical conditions at all. They don't mention rice, for example. They were familiar with the other grains such as wheat and barley, which they had cultivated. It doesn't show they'd ever heard of rice, which is cultivated so much in northeastern India. It never mentions any of the tropical animals like the tiger and the elephant and so on. So they came from a place to the north and had migrated a long distance, and they came into India through Afghanistan and the regular invasion route, the Khyber Pass, conquering first the Punjab and in time spreading out over nearly all of northern India, where they set up a kingdom which lasted until, by mongrelization, they lost their ability in about 6 centuries. They left rather extensive writings in this language, Sanskrit. And at first it seemed to be just another one of the dead languages. But finally, scholars digging into it noticed a peculiarity of it. They were finding not only that its grammar was similar to that of the white people's languages, but they began finding hundreds and hundreds of words which were so very similar that it was obvious that the white man's languages had been derived from the Sanskrit. Now, you know that today there are 4 major languages that are derived from Latin: French, Italian, Spanish, and Portuguese. None of them identical with Latin, none of them identical with each other. Their pronunciation is quite different, and even their spelling varies somewhat. And yet, a man who knows any one of these 4 languages could pick up a newspaper printed in one of the other of the four and pretty well figure out what it was about because of the obvious similarities due to the fact that the foundation on which they're all four built is Latin. Well, similarly, they were discovering that the Latin itself, as well as Greek and a lot of other languages that we use, was the Sanskrit. As just one example that I happen to remember, in the Sanskrit, the word for father, you might spell in English, they didn't have our alphabet, of course, you might spell it in English as Patir, patir. All right, go on over into Latin and into Greek, pater. Go on into Icelandic, fadir. Into German, vater. They come from an original root in the Sanskrit. And you can multiply those by the hundreds and hundreds and many more hundreds. So these people, these blonde conquerors who came into northern India approximately 2000 BC, were a people so related to us that we're still using later variants of their language. As to where they came from, you might go back to something else. The early part of the book of Genesis describes the Garden of Eden, and it's been difficult to figure where to put it. It says that in the garden, from a lake or headwater there, 4 rivers divided. 2 of them, Gihon and Pishon, are totally impossible to trace. The name is absolutely meaningless. You can't trace it to anything in ancient history or modern, and neither can you find where such a river existed. The other 2, Hiddekel, was the ancient name for what today we call Tigris River, and Phrath was the ancient name for what became Grecianized as Euphrates. If you want to find the headwaters of those, you go up into Armenia, into the mountainous region between the eastern end of the Black Sea and the western side of the Caspian Sea. And there has been, because of the names of these rivers there, generally a tendency, and I'll admit I fell for it myself, to figure that the location of the Garden of Eden must have been someplace up there. But still, geographically, it just won't fit. What are you going to do about those 2 other rivers? You can't find trace of any ancient riverbed to say they used to exist and then dried up. They just never were there. Then it dawned upon somebody. From the beginning, our people have been wanderers, always with that wanderlust to go see far places. Getting a little too crowded here. I'm going to move out where there's more elbow room and homestead there. And where we go, we tend to take familiar place names with us. You remember that I have shown you before that in the pass of Israel through the Caucasus Mountains, where some of our Scythian ancestors traveled through there, there's one very prominent peak to which they gave the name of Mount Zion. But you remember Mount Zion was a hill within the limits of the city of Jerusalem, but they took the name along with them. You go to our Atlantic coast, and not only do you find New Jersey and New York, but you go up to Connecticut, and you find the city of New London on the Thames River. But it's not the same Thames River in England that the old London is on. We just took the name along with us. Now look for a place that will answer it geographically. On the northerly slopes of the Himalaya Mountains near the western end is a big plateau, say roughly 180 miles square, rimmed by mountains 25,000 to 28,000 feet high, and today uninhabited and uninhabitable because its present altitude is about 15,000 feet, and it's too cold. You couldn't raise anything there to live on. But from a chain of lakes up there, 4 rivers do spread out in a way that answers the geographical description of the Garden of Eden. And this may well have been it. Now, we know that within what you might call historic times, practically, that some mountain regions had been elevated by great earthquake movement, had been elevated a great deal. Down in the Andes, I am told, you will find places where at the top of a great cliff mountain you find a portion of a city, and down below, a few thousand feet below at the base of the cliff, you find the rest of the city built down there. In other words, it had been split along a fault line, and half of it thrust thousands of feet up into the air. That could be one factor. Also, you know that, of course, they find in Alaska and in Siberia the remains of great tropical forests. In fact, they have dug out of the ice in glaciers in Siberia some of these great mammoths, mastodon elephants, which had died so quickly that there remained in their stomachs undigested tropical vegetation. So that the fact that a place is cold today doesn't necessarily mean it always was so. So the Pamir Plateau may very well have been the original Garden of Eden. Incidentally, both Indian, not American Indian, Hindu, and Asiatic legends all point to that region as being the place of origin of mankind, or at least civilization. So there's some old racial memory there that is worthy of note. Now, of course, Adam, after the fall, was driven out of that region. The evidence indicates that he settled in the Tarim Basin, somewhat north of that. That is today part of the Chinese province of Xinjiang, the southwesternmost portion of China. In Xinjiang province are the Chinese atom bomb factories and testing grounds. Now, some of them stayed home around there, and you remember when you come to Noah, you find that the others were killed off because they had mongrelized with the Asiatic population they found surrounding them. Your King James Version, with its extreme effort to become unintelligible, tells you that Noah was a just man and perfect in his generations, which is a meaningless phrase if ever you could find one. How can one man have generations in the plural? But you look it up in the Hebrew and it says he was perfect in his ancestry. So, Noah and his family alone had not mongrelized, and the rest who remained in that Tarim Basin, which has plenty of geological evidence to support the idea that that was the location of the flood. The others who remained there had mongrelized till they had to be destroyed. Noah's flood, of course, was not worldwide, and the Bible never says so. The preachers do. The translators translated it. The flood covered all the world and so forth. The Hebrews said it just covered Eretz, that land. Sure, when you have a flood in the Mississippi Valley, it covers Eretz, that land, not the whole world. Chinese history goes right through the period of Noah's flood without a break. Babylonian history goes right through the same period without a break. And Egyptian history goes right through it without a break. Now, I don't credit these people with being so able that after they were all dead, they continued to write history of this period. So you had a localized flood wiping out some of them. But remember, our people from the beginning have shown this wanderlust. the itchy feet to get going. Now, from any place in that region, you would have a land that would answer the description given in the Rig Veda. They came from a high land, not too high to raise crops and that sort of thing, but with enormously high mountains around them, mountains snow-clad all the year, and these great rushing torrents of snow water coming down to form their rivers. So from there, from the home of the Adamic white race, came these blonde Aryans who invaded northern India approximately 2000 BC. Don't be misled by the efforts of Jew professional liars to tell you that Aryan was only a matter of language and had nothing to do with race. The people who used it never used it in regard to language. They used it only in regard to race. The word Arya meant noble, and they called themselves Aryan, or noble. Now, they had come into a place where, in South India, to which they probably never penetrated, southern half, you had the utterly negroid Dravidians. But in North India, there had been an earlier invasion of a white race. The only real civilization in India, other than that brought by these Aryans, had evolved in northern India. And their description of the people they found shows that those who were there when the Aryans came were not the pure black Negro Dravidians, but they were a mongrel mulatto race. They'd had a pretty high culture. You remember reading in the last few years of the archaeologists digging up the long-forgotten city of Mohenjo-Daro, for example. Now, there was a brick city. The remains we find of the cities in the Babylonian and Assyrian Empire in the Tigris-Euphrates valleys were laid out with no science at all. Their streets were wandering cow paths, narrow, crooked. But here in Mohenjo-Daro, you have a modern street grid laid out at right angles, north, south, east, west. A well-built brick city with tremendous brick fortification walls and towers around it. So that, as originally created, it was the product of people with tremendous energy and good engineering skill. But wherever you find, and this is the invariable lesson of history, wherever you find two very different races in contact, mongrelization, and thereby the destruction of a higher type, always comes. So by the time these Aryans came in, there were people living in Mohenjo-Daro, a beautiful fortification, and they no longer had the courage and the determination and the character to defend it, and they were easily overrun and conquered. Well, the lesson was not lost on the Aryans. They had a fierce race pride because they realized only their racial characteristics were what gave them power. And they were determined not to perish by mongrelization the way this earlier white race, which they overran, had perished. Perished, as I say, as a white race, because what was left were mulattoes. You will find Hindus today who have the white man's mold of feature, but they're black as my shoes if it comes to complexion. Black as any Negro you'd ever meet. And you know what India has been as far back as any recorded history goes, nothing but the cesspool of the earth. As they mongrelized with these Dravidian Negroes, they became what any mulatto always becomes. He can't create anything new. He can't even keep up to standard what his white ancestors had originally developed. So these Aryans set up a rigid system of castes. They had among themselves 4 castes: warriors, priests, a 3rd caste was farmers and merchants, and finally the 4th caste was laborers. Now the upper castes rather looked down a little on the others as being not quite their equal, though they were still of the Aryan race. But now the people they found living there that they conquered in India, they didn't even honor them to the extent of creating the 5th caste for them. They were outcasts. Rigid laws against any intermarriage or race mixing were enacted, and in fact you were not supposed to marry outside of your caste. You had, even among the whites, an aristocracy among the whites, and they wanted to preserve it. And after a time, caste finally became hereditary among them, although at the very start this was not so. But remember, anybody who would have intercourse with a Negro is the scum and filth of the white race anyway, and very probably about the same part of the Negro race too. Those who have any pride of race of their own, on either side, look down upon mixing. Now, such children as, in spite of their law against it, no marriage was allowed, but there was mixing outside of marriage. And the resultant mongrel children were not allowed to live within any city where the Aryan peoples were. Both races utterly despised them. The Aryan soldiery were authorized to kill them on sight for most any cause, but just the same, it went on. The mixing of the scum of both races, so that your mongrel is a mixture of the worst of both races. Well, what happens? First you have mulattoes, and then pretty soon you have quadroons, 1/4 black, 3/4 white. And then pretty soon you have the octoroons, who are 7/8 white and 1/4 Negro. And some of them good-looking, some of them light-complected enough to pass as rather a dark-complected white man, and some of them do and get away with it. And all this time you have the sob sister type. Oh, these poor people. We mustn't discriminate against them. Why, they would like to marry a white woman, same as anybody else. Why shouldn't we allow them to do it? Why should we discriminate, and so on? And as I say, the lighter they get, the stronger this pressure is. Well, in the course of 6 centuries, nature took its course. The highest civilization that India knew was brought in there by these Aryans, and it crumbled in 6 centuries as a result of mongrelization. These Aryans who went in there had a fairly high religion. No, it wasn't ours, but at least they had but one god, whom they called Indra. And they despised and utterly looked down upon the low animal worship of the Hindus among whom they were. Now they had one peculiar thing in here, which may be a racial memory of something. There are a lot of these legends, you know, that creep up, and you only find them after the poets have worked on them for a bit, but the poet had to get his idea from someplace. And some of these race memories that crop up centuries later are interesting to trace back to their source. They said that their god Indra had been incarnated at the time of the invasion as a man, as a warrior leader. to be their leader and take them into this new land of northwestern India. He was a big, powerful man, hard drinking, hard fighting like the rest of their warriors, with tawny beard, light complexion, blue eyes, a fierce warrior. Now, before you condemn that as utter paganism, remember this. Your Bible records a number of instances where God appeared in the form of a man. You remember, for example, Abraham was sitting at the door of his tent a few hours' journey away from the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, and 3 men came along, and Abraham, following the Oriental custom of hospitality, greeted them, asked them to stop, and he would prepare food for them, refresh themselves before they went on. They told him they were going down to Sodom to see if it was as bad as it had been reported, and if so, to destroy it. Now, you go back and read that passage in your book of Genesis. And one of them unmistakably speaks not as an angel, as God. He talks about what he is going to do to Sodom there. And Abraham recognizes who it is. You remember he speaks up and he says, but there might be 50 decent people in the city. Would you destroy the whole city and leave 50 people along with them because the rest of them are bad? And God said, no. If I find 50 people there, I'll spare it. Well, Abraham was still worried. He had better things to worry about. But remember, stupidity is our one most outstanding characteristic. We worry about the wrong things. Well, maybe there aren't 50, but perhaps there are only 40. Wouldn't you spare the city for 40? God said, yes, if I can find even 40, I'd spare it. And Abraham keeps arguing, trying to get the city out of its trouble, and finally he gets worried. He said, here I've been arguing with God himself over this. And this same one of the 3 men, you remember, he says, now, why should I hide from Abraham the thing that I am going to do? I know him, his character. I know he's going to bring up his children right after him so they will follow according to my commandments. And I am going to make of Abraham a great nation, and so on. The Bible tells you that was God in human form. And you'll find several other instances of that sort. Now, it couldn't, of course, have been any race memory of the time when God appeared in human form as Jesus Christ, because remember, this was 2,000 years before Christ. But just the same, perhaps there is a little of this race memory coming in here when they say that God appeared to be their leader. Remember now, he didn't make himself in human form. He appeared as this tremendous column of fire by night and cloud by day to lead his people out of Egypt and into Palestine. So maybe they have some old race memory as a foundation for saying that their god Indra, God incarnated in human form, was their leader.